Dear students, I am very happy today to share my thoughts on the topic New International Economic Order in the context of India. We all know that India became independent in 1947, and before that, we know that the entire world was passing through different kinds of turmoil. There was a Great Depression, and thereafter there was Second World War. During the war time, the developed country had already thought that the colonialism will be different. That is, the colonialism will end, but that will be the end of the political colonialism. And the developed country had the idea that the process of the exploitation of the resources of the developing world should continue under the hegemony of the West, and therefore President Roosevelt and the Prime Minister of United Kingdom, they thought that although we are going to grant political liberty, but we should not be in haste to allow them the full economic freedom. And therefore, sometime around July 1941, they formed a committee which was largely under the guidance of the Council for Foreign Relations, that is CFR of United States, and to the then experts, the economists John Maynard Keynes and Dexter White. They took the lead, and it took them almost about 3 years when in July 1944 a conference was held in Bretton Woods, and the whole idea of holding this conference was to get the attestation of the developing countries before they were granted independence. So we can understand the logic. So for example, India was granted independence in 1947, but this conference was held in 1944. And so several countries who were about to be granted independence, so in 1944 they were still as a colony, and therefore they were bound to agree to the terms of what was designed as per Grand Area Plan. And in the Bretton Woods conference, basically these two experts, they had designed that they would constitute different kinds of institutions to regulate the trade, commerce and investment in the forthcoming years, so that the hegemony of the West can continue. And therefore they established these three institutions, namely the International Monetary Fund to control the entire monetary system, the World Bank in the name of International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the third institution which they had conceived as International Trade Organization, which could not take the full shape, and later on in 1948, from 1/1/1948, this was established as GATT, General Agreement on Tariff and Trade. Now with these three institutions, the whole idea was that in the coming years, when these countries which were so long under the colonial rule, so therefore the idea was to grant the political freedom by decolonization of the political system, but to be replaced de facto through a process of economic colonialism. So, this was the whole idea. Now, the developing countries, soon after they got independence, they could realize the sense that this process of colonialism, that is economic, in the name of economic globalism, would not allow them to use their natural resources, their human resources in the most effective way, and they also felt that they may be in the need of capital or the technology. So, there should be some changes in the Bretton Woods system. So, they insisted for a new system, and for that different kind of conferences took place, and the first conference which took place was in the name of Bandung Conference in 1955, and that was followed by ALCO, Asian African Legal Consultative Organization, intergovernmental organization. So, that was the idea that they should review the legal as well as the economic outcome, so that equitable justice is done to the newly independent countries. United States wanted to maintain its hegemony, and basically it was the shift from Pax Britannicana to Pax Americana. And for this, United States thought that they should have the control on the entire monetary system, and the underlining understanding between the European countries and the United States was that the World Bank would be under the presidency of a nominee from United States of America, and the head of International Monetary Fund would be nominated by European countries. And it was agreed that gold standard would be replaced and US dollar will be treated as the international currency of reserve. So, the process started whereby the economic colonialism was to be replaced by economic globalism, and the developing countries started feeling the pain of this economic globalism and the kind of hegemony which the United States wanted to continue its process of exploitation of the raw material and the human resource of the developing world. And the United Nations, it understood, and in the process the first and foremost resolution in support of the developing country was the establishment of UNCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. The declaration of United States for the new international economic order, first the declaration was made on 1st May 1974, and thereafter a charter was declared, and in the charter also it was recognized that yes, there is a need for developing countries to be given the priority for a just and equitable process for their development, for international trade, as well as for the trade investment and also for the transfer of technology. And what we find today, that through the dollar diplomacy and through the process of the globalization, United States and the Western world still tries to dominate the global economy. And the result which we find today, that the world is unequal. There is an inequality in the global income. There is inequality in the per capita income. There is inequality in the consumption, and there is a clear divide between the north and the south. As per the World Bank, the global GDP is $96 trillion, whereas the GDP of United States is $23 trillion. Now, if you look at the population, the global population is 800 crore, of which the population of United States is 33.42 crores. Now, if you look at the population of United States as a proportion of the global population, it is 4.18%, whereas when you look at the share of United States in the global GDP, there we find the United States share in the global GDP is 23.93%. That means the population is nearly 4% and the share in the GDP is almost around 24%. That is 6 times. Whereas when you look at India, for example, what we find, our population is nearly 140 crores and our share in the global population is about 17%. Whereas our GDP today, despite so many years of economic reforms, is still around $3 trillion, which is about 3.3% of the global GDP. Now, as I have said about India and US, when you look at the population and the GDP of China, there also we find that China's population today is about 140 crores as against the world population of about 800 crore, and their share therefore in the global population is about 18%. But China over the last 40 years has made much progress and their share in the global GDP is almost around 18 trillion. So, what we find is China's share in the global population is about 18% and their share in the global GDP is also about 18%. So, it cannot be said per se that the globalization is at itself or the only factor responsible for the unequal world. There has to be some internal policy changes also to take advantage of the globalization. So, therefore, it is not a straightway route to say that yes, globalization or the present economic system has led to the inequality. There is necessity of looking back the internal policies of the concerned government also. And according to that purchasing power, China's GDP, which is $18 trillion as per the nominal exchange rate, becomes 27.31. And the US GDP, since everything is defined in US dollars, so US GDP remain constant at $23 trillion, and therefore, as per the purchasing power, the Indian economy becomes the third largest economy, China being number 1, US being number 2, and India becoming number 3. So, although as per the nominal exchange rate, Indian economy size is number 5th after Japan and Germany, being 3rd and 4th. Therefore, it is also important to understand as regards the exchange rate policy of India, because in 1980, Indian rupee was 8 rupee per US dollar, which has now become 80 rupees per dollar, whereas in case of China, the Chinese yuan, which was also 8 yuan per US dollar in 1980, that is just 6.5 yuan per US dollar. So, therefore, the policy issue whether India should continue the policy of floating exchange rate and uh, the acceptance of the devaluation the way India is pursuing, because in 1991 also, when we pushed through the new economic policy and the economic reforms, the Indian rupee was 16 rupee per US dollar, but now it has been devaluated almost by 5 times from 16 to 80, whereas in case of China, over the last 40 years, Chinese yuan has gained the strength. Basically, what we find is that US always wanted to have hegemony on the global economy, and the most funny part is that while constituting the Bretton Woods institution, United States had given an assurance to the global community that yes, you can rely on US dollar, and there is a written document while creating this that United States will make the US dollar convertible in gold, and the promise was that anytime any country which is keeping its international reserve in US dollar, now the first test of the false or the treacherous promise of United States was came to surface in 1971 with the first oil shock. And as I said that through the process of United Nation, when UNCTAD was created, some partial success was achieved through the declaration of the United Nations and passing of the resolution towards the new international economic order, though the formal declaration was made only in 1974. But the developing countries partially started getting some benefit, and the first experience was when the oil prices increased from $3 per barrel to $11 per barrel between 1973 and 1974, and this led to balance of payment problem in many of the countries. So United Kingdom, France, everybody demanded from United States that yes, we want to exchange dollar with gold. Then the United States President Nixon, he clearly denied, and he said, no, I cannot exchange the dollar in gold. And the prices of the gold, which went up from whatever it was in 1944, well, it could be near to $35 per ounce, but then in 1971-72 it went up to almost $800 to $1,000 per ounce of gold. And so that was the time when the rest of the world or the United States, United Nations or the IMF should have come to a conclusion that yes, no longer we would allow dollar to continue as the international currency of reserve. But it was only through a very simple process that special drawing right, SDR, was created in IMF, but SDR could never become the international currency of reserve, and the process still continues. So what we find is that the dollar diplomacy, and in the process of dollar remaining the international currency of reserve, the advantage to the United States is, and which is creating a lot of contradiction in the entire global economy, that United States can print any number of dollar it wants, and it will not have any kind of impact on the US economy. Number two, United States can borrow any amount of money from the rest of the world. It will not have any impact on its credit rating or on its borrowing rate. Now we find today that in the process, United States today is the biggest debtor of the world. Its borrowing from the rest of the world is almost $30 trillion. Even the China or whichever country, including Korea, Hong Kong, or all other countries which have their balance of payment in surplus, they are bound to deposit it in Fed Reserve in their US Treasury at a very negligible rate of interest. So, through this process of dollar diplomacy, United States is getting the debt at a almost zero rate or a very nominal rate. So, what we find that although in 2008-9 there was banking crisis in United States of America, that subprime crisis, but US through quantitative easing they printed lot of money. Even during the COVID time they printed lot of US dollar. Now we feel yes, there is little impact on the inflation, but by and large United States have been taking the sole advantage of its dollar. After the end of the Second World War, the newly independent countries were under a lot of pressure from the capitalist bloc on the one hand and the communist bloc on the other hand, because there was a Cold War era, and both the blocs, the Western bloc consisting of OECD group of countries led by United States, they wanted countries to have more and more economic alliance with them, and the communist bloc led by Russia, they wanted the countries, particularly in the Eastern Europe, to be their allies. So, in between, the developing countries, they formed an alliance which is known as the NAM, non-aligned movement, and that also had some success, but that was not giving much alternative result. After the fall of Berlin Wall in 1989 and after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990, United States got some further leverage, some advantage, because earlier there was bipolar world, and after 1991 we find that there was unipolar world. So, United States could continue with its open market policy, and for India also we also went for liberalization, privatization, globalization, the process. So, globalization was moving in a very fast pace during the decade of 90s and 2000, and even today, even till now, although we are hearing now about deglobalization and more of the nationalist approach by many countries after the post-COVID situation. A third way is required, which is more equitable for the poor people, because today almost 80% of the world in the south, they are still very deprived, whether they are in Latin America or are in African country or in the Asian countries, 7 except the East Asian countries which were known as the Asian tigers, say for example Singapore or Indonesia to some extent, and Malaysia. Japan had a different story because Japan is amongst the developed countries, but East Asian countries partially they could take advantage, but then in 1997 they had some setback from the globalization because they had more borrowings. But then by and large what we find that the globalization in the open market economy, this has not given much heed to the proper the equitable growth of the developing countries. What we find that even the WTO, this is also not giving the due equitable scope for the developing countries, and then partially the developing countries through the alliance, earlier through G77 and then through the G110, the group of 110. So that yielded partially through the Doha round in 2001, but then United States never wanted the advantage of the market access to the developing countries. And today what we find after the Nairobi WTO conference, the Doha agenda has been dismantled. There is no Doha development agenda now in the WTO, because whether it was UNCTAD or WTO, as long as they could take advantage of these institutions to their favor, they allowed it to function. But the day they started feeling that yes, now it is going to the favor of the developing countries, they have not allowed these institutions to function. So today, neither WTO nor UNCTAD are effectively working, because now the developing countries, they know their right, what is good for them. So if we look at the few issues in summary form, what was contained in the UN Charter of December 1974 for this new international economic order. So basically, it was for taking care of the sovereignty of the developing countries, about their territorial integrity and the political independence of the state. That was number one. And sovereignty means equality of all the states, non-aggression, non-intervention, mutual and equitable benefit, peaceful existence, equal rights and self-determination of the people, peaceful settlement of the disputes, remedying of injustices which have been brought about by the forces and which deprive a nation of the natural means necessary for its normal development, fulfillment in good faith of the international obligations, respect for human rights and international obligations, no attempt to seek hegemony and sphere of influence, promotion of international social justice, international cooperation for development, free access to and from the sea by landlocked countries within the framework of the above principles. But you see, now almost after 50 years of the declaration and the contents of the charter, what we find that the objectives of the so-called declaration of the United Nations have not been achieved fully, and nor there is very serious attempt or discussion about the new international economic order. So I think now, earlier G7 countries, they used to use their dictum for how the developing countries would behave. The OECD group of countries, they used to decide how the global economy should work. So accordingly, the entire process of the technology transfer, the flow of capital, etc., have taken place. But today, what we find that these have created not only imbalances in the regional growth, it has also created problems for the environment. Today, what we find that due to excess carbon emission, and basically the developed country, United States and the European countries, they were the countries which have created this problem. So the total deposit in the carbon is mostly by this developed country, and today through this Paris Agreement, they want to create pressure on the developing countries to stop emitting carbon through the fossil fuel, and a lot of net zero commitment, etc. we are talking. But then if you look at the per capita carbon emission, there also we find that developed countries, they are doing maximum emission. The per capita emission from the countries like India and other African countries, not that much. Now, India is leading the G20 group of nations, which comprises almost 85% of the global population. So definitely under the leadership of our Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, I think in 2023, when India is giving leadership to the G20 nation, I think all these irrationality and the illogical aspects of the globalization of the present economic order, I think India would be able to convince the other countries to bring a real effective economic system whereby the lifestyle of the people should change. Because now we find that the Western culture, which is more on the consumption, there are, the family system, the community system is collapsing. People are not having the proper way of living. So, the growth always means the growth, the prosperity should go together with the peace. So, peace and prosperity with a sustainable growth. We have to take care of the nature. The mother earth has to be, saved. So, whether it is forestation or it is safeguarding our nature from all perspective for a peaceful and healthy life, I think that kind of system is required, where there is neither exploitation of the human resource nor the excess exploitation of the natural resource, and the capital should not dominate. Capital will have a role, but as the World Bank has also said, that today in the present era of knowledge, technology and innovation, where the human resource contributes to 64% of the economic resources, natural resources 20%, and capital resource only 16%. So, therefore, the human resource, the humanistic approach of development should dominate, whereby the inequality which is prevailing in the present system, that can be reduced, and the people suffering from the problems of poverty, unemployment, that should gradually come down.